That basil plant you bought for $4? It's not one plant. It's a dozen or more, crammed into one tiny pot, fighting each other just to survive. At the base of that pot, here's the giveaway. You won't see one stem. You'll see a tangle of them, all shoved into the same few inches of dirt. And that's exactly why it keeps dying on you. Today, why that crowding kit and how to split it apart without spending a dime. Those extra stems become a whole new crop, 20 plants or more. I've pulled this from real plant science, not just a kitchen trick. Here's why this works, and it's not just about giving each plant more room. In a second, I'll show you exactly why crowding kills it, and it's not what you'd think. Here's the thing. Back in the 1980s, researchers in Egypt actually measured this. They planted basil at different spacings, some crowded, some given real room to grow. The crowded plants came out lighter, with fewer branches and less green color in every trial. Now here's the thing. Gardeners who've split these pots for years and that Egyptian spacing study both land on the same point. Less crowding tends to mean a stronger plant. So the fix isn't fancy fertilizer. It's just giving each stem its own space. Extension guides from Clemson and Rutgers agree on the spacing. 6 inches to 2 feet apart in a garden bed. In that grocery pot, each stem barely gets more room than the width of your thumb. No wonder it wilts by the time you get it home from the store. And that starts with exactly where you cut. A node is the target, that little bump where a leaf meets the stem. That's the spot. That exact placement decides whether the cutting roots at all. Here's why that exact spot matters. When you cut a stem, the plant's hormone gets stuck right at the cut. It pools at that node instead of moving on. That pooled hormone is what tells the stem to grow brand new roots right there. Cut in the middle between 2 nodes and there's almost nothing for it to work with. The tissue between 2 nodes is basically inactive. It doesn't have what it takes to grow new roots, no matter how long you leave it in water. Quick note before we start cutting, this whole method's pet and kid friendly. No sprays, no chemicals, just snips, water, and dirt. The cut itself, 4 to 6 inches long, just below a node, with the bottom third stripped of leaves. No rooting hormone needed, no special tools, just clean garden snips. A few leaves stay up top, so the cutting still has enough to work with. Everything else stays low, out of the water. The whole cut takes about a minute once you know what you're looking for. That's the cut handled. Now you need somewhere for it to actually root. Any dirt cheap glass jar from the kitchen cabinet works, filled with water. The cutting goes in, so that node sits under the surface, with no leaves touching the water. Bright, indirect light is the spot, not blazing sun all day. A kitchen windowsill or a spot near a sink works fine, as long as it's bright but not scorching. That water gets changed every 2 to 3 days, so it stays clean. Leaves sitting in water break down fast and turn the whole jar cloudy. That invites the kind of bacteria that rots a stem before it ever gets the chance to root. That's it. No pots, no mess to clean up. Yet. Now comes the part everyone rushes. Waiting. Don't panic if you don't see roots by day 7. That's not the real timeline. The full timeline runs 10 to 14 days. That's when real, visible roots usually show up. There's no need to rush this or get it perfect. Basil roots on its own schedule, not yours. Once those roots reach about an inch long, that cutting is ready for soil. Or it can stay in its own jar of water long term. Moving to soil? A light, well-draining potting mix works best. A good watering right away keeps those new roots from drying out during the switch. And here's where the real multiplying begins. Remember that dozen or more stems you started with? Once each one roots, you can cut fresh stems from those too. Adding up the originals plus the new rounds of cuttings lands you at 20 plants or more. No extra pot to buy. Say you separate a dozen crowded stems and root all of them. One more cutting from each, and that's already over 20 plants. And this next part is for anyone whose basil always goes leggy and sparse by midsummer. Once a seedling grows its first 6 leaves, a pinch right above the second set does the trick. That one small pinch does something specific. It removes the hormone signal that was keeping side buds shut down. With that signal gone, 2 new branches wake up right at that spot instead of just one tall stem. Here's something almost nobody knows about that trick. Back in 1880, Charles Darwin ran an experiment on grass seedlings growing in the dark. He and his son cut the very tip off some of them. Then they shined light from one side on all of them. The seedlings with their tips still on bent toward the light. The ones with the tip cut off didn't move at all. That experiment eventually led to the discovery of the exact hormone we've been talking about this whole video. It's the same one that pulls at your basil's cut node, and it's the same one that gets released when you pinch it. One hormone doing 2 different jobs in the exact same plant. That pinch happens again every time a branch grows 6 to 8 new leaves. You'll get a bushier plant that keeps producing all season instead of racing to flower. A basil plant that's allowed to flower stops putting energy into leaves, and the leaves that are left turn bitter. Adding that up with all the cuttings rooted along the way tells the real story. That one crowded $4 pot turns into a whole windowsill of thriving basil. 20 plants or more. So let's bring this all together. That basil plant was never weak. It was just never given room to be anything else. That's not a guess. It's the same growing science extension researchers have documented for years. Splitting it apart, cutting a few stems below a node, and dropping them in water today, that's the move. In a couple of weeks, you'll have a jar full of white roots to show for it. The proof's in the roots, as they say. That's a plan for 20 plants that didn't cost you another $1. Cuttings like these are the kind of thing that used to get passed hand to hand. A jar on a neighbor's porch, a stem tucked into a grandkid's backpack. Splitting the stems means skipping the store run and the windowsill full of basil all summer long. If you're the kind of gardener who'd rather grow more from what you've already got than buy more of it, You're exactly who this channel's for. So here's a question for the comments. How many stems do you think you can pull from your own basil pot right now? Happy gardening.